In the bustling megacities of modern China, where gleaming skyscrapers pierce the clouds and bullet trains slice through ancient landscapes at 300 kilometers per hour, something extraordinary happens each morning. In Shanghai's financial district, Beijing's government corridors, and Shenzhen's tech hubs, millions of people begin their day guided by principles first articulated by a wandering teacher 25 centuries ago. His ideas shape boardroom decisions, family dinners, and the education of over 200 million Chinese students. Across East Asia, from Seoul to Singapore, from Tokyo to Taipei, another billion lives move to rhythms he established. His influence extends far beyond Asia. Harvard Business School teaches his management principles. Silicon Valley entrepreneurs quote his wisdom, and world leaders invoke his name. This is the enduring power of Confucius, better known to the world as Confucius. To understand China, its past triumphs, present complexities, and future ambitions, one must understand the man whose thoughts became the bedrock of the world's oldest continuous civilization. The China of 551 BCE bore little resemblance to today's economic powerhouse. Picture instead a fractured landscape of warring states, where bronze weapons clashed in endless battles and noble families schemed for power while common people suffered. This was the tail end of the spring and autumn period, an era of such chaos that Chinese historians named it after a chronicle documenting its constant upheavals. In the state of Lu, roughly where modern Shandong province stands today, farmers worked fields that might change hands with each military campaign. The old Zhou dynasty system, which had maintained order through ritual and hierarchy for centuries, was crumbling like ancient jade exposed to flame. Imagine living in a world where the very concept of social order was disappearing, explains Professor Li Wei of Beijing Normal University, a leading scholar of pre-Qin philosophy. The bronze vessels used in sacred rituals were being melted down for weapons. Sons were overthrowing fathers, ministers assassinating lords. The mandate of heaven that justified political authority seemed to have abandoned the earth entirely. The traditional bonds holding society together between ruler and subject, parent and child, husband and wife, stretched to the breaking point. Regional warlords commanded private armies, levying crushing taxes on peasants who might face 3 different governments in a single lifetime. The soundscape of this era rang with discord. The clash of bronze against bronze, the cries of refugees fleeing burning villages, the heated arguments in courts where advisors proposed increasingly ruthless strategies for survival. Yet it was precisely this chaos that created the conditions for China's greatest philosophical flowering. Crisis breeds innovation, notes Dr. Sarah Chen, historian at the National University of Singapore. The breakdown of the old order forced Chinese thinkers to ask fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and the source of legitimate authority. Into this intellectual ferment stepped Confucius. The state of Lu occupied a unique position in this chaotic landscape. As the ancestral home of the Duke of Zhou, architect of the Zhou ritual system, Lu preserved more ancient traditions than its militaristic neighbors. Its capital, Qufu, maintained schools where young nobles still learned the old ceremonies, even as their practical relevance faded. The city's walls, built from rammed earth and faced with stone, enclosed temples where bronze bells still rang out the proper rhythms for seasonal sacrifices. Markets bustled with merchants trading silk from the south, jade from the west, and scrolls containing the wisdom of ages past. It was here, in a small compound near the city's eastern gate, that Confucius was born on September 28, 551 BCE. The exact circumstances of Confucius's birth blend historical fact with legend, as often happens with transformative figures. His father, Kang He, also known as Xu He, was a minor military officer renowned for his extraordinary strength. Stories tell of him single-handedly holding up a falling gate to allow his troops to escape an ambush. already in his 60s with 9 daughters and a disabled son from previous marriages. Kang He desperately needed a healthy male heir to continue the family rituals. He approached the Yan family, proposing marriage to one of their 3 daughters. The youngest, Yan Zhengzai, barely 16, volunteered despite the dramatic age difference. The marriage itself tells us much about the social dynamics of the time, observes Professor Wang Xiaming of Fudan University. Here we see the intersection of military merit, social ambition, and ritual obligation that would later feature so prominently in Confucian thought. Legend speaks of Yan Zhengzai praying at the sacred Mount Nai, where she received a vision of the Qilin, a mythical creature whose appearance heralds the birth of a sage. More prosaically, historical records suggest she gave birth in a cave on the mountain slope, possibly because her husband's first wife refused to allow the delivery in the family home. The child born that autumn day bore the marks of his unusual origin. Ancient texts describe his prominent forehead, said to resemble the sacred Mount Nai itself, earning him the childhood name Qiu, meaning hill. His given name, Zhangni, incorporated both the mountain's name and his position as a second son. From birth, Kang Qiu straddled 2 worlds, connected to nobility through his father's lineage traced back to the Shang dynasty kings, yet growing up in genteel poverty after his father died when he was 3. Yan Zhengzai faced the daunting task of raising her son alone, refused support by her late husband's first family. They lived in the humble neighborhood of Kueli, where she took in washing and sewing to survive. This early experience of hardship proved formative, notes Dr. Michael Zhang, author of The Making of a Sage. Confucius learned firsthand the struggles of common people, even as his mother insisted on teaching him the rituals and learning appropriate to his noble ancestry. This dual perspective, aristocratic ideals filtered through common experience, would define his revolutionary approach to education and governance. Young Kang Qiu displayed an unusual fascination with ritual from his earliest years. While other children played war games with wooden swords, he arranged pottery vessels in precise formations, mimicking the temple ceremonies he observed from afar. His mother, recognizing both his intelligence and their precarious social position, scraped together funds for his education. At 7, he entered the local school, where students memorized ancient texts and learned the 6 arts of a gentleman: ritual, music, archery, charioteering, calligraphy, and mathematics. The boy's poverty marked him among his wealthier classmates. He later recalled, "When I was young, I was in humble circumstances, and therefore I acquired skills in many menial things." Yet this disadvantage became a strength. While noble children learned rituals as empty forms, Kang Qiu understood their deeper significance: how ceremony could create harmony from chaos, how proper relationships could heal a fractured society. His teachers noted his insatiable curiosity, how he would remain after lessons to ask about the historical origins of each ritual gesture, the philosophical reasoning behind each classical poem. At 15, Kang Qiu made a decision that would shape his destiny. "I set my heart on learning," he later told disciples. This wasn't merely academic ambition, but a total commitment to understanding the principles underlying cosmic and social order. He haunted the state archives, copying ancient texts by candlelight. He interviewed elderly ritual masters, memorizing their descriptions of ceremonies unseen for generations. When noble families performed sacrifices, he stationed himself where he could observe every detail, every gesture, every intonation of the sacred hymns. His reputation for learning attracted the attention of the Jisun clan, one of 3 powerful families controlling Lu's government. At 19, they appointed him to a minor position managing their granaries. Here, Kang Qiu demonstrated the practical application of his philosophical principles. He instituted precise recording systems, ensuring fair distribution during lean times. Even in managing grain supplies, writes the Han historian Sima Qian, He showed how righteousness and careful attention to duty could transform mundane tasks into moral acts. Marriage at 19 to Kiguan brought a son, Kong Li, but domestic life couldn't contain his intellectual ambitions. Promoted to supervise public works and livestock, he revolutionized both departments through systematic organization and ethical management. Yet success in administration only deepened his conviction that society's problems required more fundamental solutions. The rituals and wisdom that had sustained Chinese civilization for a millennium were disappearing, replaced by naked force and cunning. Someone needed to preserve and revitalize this heritage, to show how ancient wisdom could address contemporary crises. At 30, Kong Qiu made another life-defining declaration. I established myself. No longer content with minor positions, he opened his own school, a revolutionary act in an era when education remained the monopoly of noble families. I have never refused instruction to anyone who sought it, he proclaimed, even if they could only afford a bundle of dried meat as payment. This radical democratization of learning would transform Chinese society. Farmers' sons studied alongside nobles, merchants debated ethics with warriors. The curriculum went beyond mere literacy to encompass moral cultivation, practical governance, and the ultimate question: how should human beings live together in harmony? The concept of Ren, Chinese letter, stands at the heart of Confucian philosophy, yet its meaning resists simple translation. The character itself provides clues, combining the radical for person with the number 2, suggesting human relationships as the foundation of virtue. Often rendered as benevolence or humaneness, Ren encompasses love, kindness, and the full development of one's humanity through proper relationships with others. When we examine how Confucius used Ren in different contexts, explains Professor Liu Xiaogan of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, we see it's not a fixed quality but a dynamic responsiveness to others. It's the ability to recognize the full humanity in every person you encounter and to act accordingly. Confucius himself seemed reluctant to define Ren precisely, preferring to point toward it through examples and negation. When asked directly, he might respond, "Is Ren really so far away? If I desire Ren, then Ren is at hand." The practical manifestation of Ren appears in the principle of Shu, Chinese letter, reciprocity or empathy. Confucius articulated this in what became known as the Golden Rule. Do not impose on others what you do not wish for yourself. But this wasn't mere passive restraint. The complementary principle of Zhang, Chinese letter, demanded active loyalty and devotion to others' well-being. Together, these concepts created an ethical framework based not on divine commands or abstract reasoning, but on the cultivation of human sympathy and social awareness. Consider how Confucius demonstrated these principles in practice. When his stables caught fire, his first question was anyone hurt? Showing more concern for the servants than for valuable horses. When a student fell asleep during lessons, rather than showing anger, Confucius reflected on his own failure as a teacher to keep the material engaging. This consistent prioritization of human welfare over material concerns or rigid rules exemplified Ren in action. The second pillar of Confucian thought, Li, Chinese letter, usually translated as ritual or propriety, extends far beyond religious ceremonies. Li encompasses all the patterns of behavior that create harmonious social life, from the proper way to greet an elder to the conduct of state diplomacy. Many Western interpreters mistake Li for empty formalism, notes Dr. Roger Ames of the University of Hawaii. But for Confucius, these patterns were technologies for cultivating virtue and creating social harmony. Like a musician practicing scales to eventually play beautiful music spontaneously, one practices Li to eventually embody Ren naturally. The character for Li originally depicted a ritual vessel used in sacrifices, but Confucius expanded its meaning to include all actions that acknowledge and honor our connections to others. When serving tea to a guest, the specific gestures, both hands on the cup, a slight bow, the proper words of offering, transform a simple biological act of hydration into an affirmation of human dignity and social bonds. Li provides a vocabulary for expressing respect, maintaining boundaries, and navigating complex social situations without constant conflict. Confucius insisted that Li without genuine feeling became empty performance. If a man is not Ren, he taught, what has he to do with ritual? If a man is not Ren, what has he to do with music? The forms must express authentic virtue, not replace it. This balance between structure and sincerity, between tradition and genuine feeling, remains one of Confucianism's most sophisticated insights. The concept of zhengaming, Chinese letter, often translated as rectification of names, addresses the relationship between language, reality, and social order. Confucius argued that social chaos stemmed partly from the misuse of language. When words no longer corresponded to reality, people couldn't communicate effectively or maintain proper relationships. A ruler who doesn't truly rule, a father who doesn't act fatherly, a ritual performed without understanding. These disconnections between names and realities corrode social trust. Zhengaming isn't about linguistic pedantry, explains Professor Chen Lai of Tsinghua University. It's about ensuring that our categories and roles align with their proper functions. When a corrupt official is called honorable, when exploitation is labeled development, when selfishness masquerades as freedom, society loses its moral compass. Confucius saw clear, honest language as essential for both personal cultivation and political reform. The doctrine of the Junzi, Chinese letter, usually translated as gentleman or exemplary person, provides Confucianism's model for human development. The Junzi represents not a fixed state but an ongoing aspiration, someone constantly cultivating virtue, learning from others, and contributing to social harmony. Unlike the Greek philosophical ideal of the sage possessing perfect wisdom, the Junzi remains dynamically engaged with self-improvement and social responsibility. Confucius contrasted the Junzi with the Zhaoran, Chinese letter, or petty person, driven by profit and self-interest. The Junzi understands what is right. The Zhaoran understands what is profitable, he observed. Yet this wasn't a simple class distinction. Nobles could be Zhaoran in their behavior, while commoners could aspire to become Junzi through education and moral cultivation. The Junzi seeks harmony without conformity, stands firm on principles while remaining flexible in application, and maintains dignity without arrogance. The path to becoming a Junzi involves constant learning, critical self-reflection, and practical application of wisdom. The Junzi is distressed by their own lack of ability, not by the fact that others do not appreciate their ability, Confucius taught. This inward focus on self-cultivation rather than external recognition marked a radical departure from the honor-shame dynamics of aristocratic culture. For the 20 years following Confucius's death in 479 BCE, his ideas remained confined to a small circle of devoted disciples. They preserved his sayings, debated their interpretations, and attempted to live by his teachings while serving in various governmental positions. The transformation of Confucianism from one philosophy among many to the orthodox ideology of the Chinese state represents one of history's most remarkable intellectual victories. The initial resistance was fierce. Legalist philosophers dismissed Confucian idealism as impractical nostalgia. Mohists criticized the emphasis on family loyalty as promoting favoritism. Taoists mocked the elaborate rituals as artificial constraints on natural spontaneity. When Qin Shi Huang unified China in 221 BCE, he actively suppressed Confucian texts, supposedly burning books and burying scholars alive. The first emperor saw Confucian scholars as threats to his radical reforms, explains Professor Mark Lewis of Stanford University. Their constant appeals to ancient precedent conflicted with his vision of a completely new order. Yet the Qin dynasty's brutal efficiency proved its own undoing. After its collapse, the Han Dynasty founder Liu Bang, a peasant rebel turned emperor, initially showed little interest in Confucian learning. The turning point came when Confucian scholars demonstrated how their philosophy could legitimize and stabilize imperial rule. The concept of the mandate of heaven, the idea that legitimate authority derived from moral virtue rather than mere force, offered rulers a powerful justification while simultaneously constraining their behavior. Emperor Wu of Han, 140–187 BCE, made the decisive move, establishing Confucianism as state orthodoxy and creating an imperial academy based on Confucian texts. This wasn't simply intellectual preference, notes Dr. Benjamin Ellman of Princeton University. The Confucian emphasis on hierarchy, loyalty, and social harmony aligned perfectly with imperial needs for a stable bureaucracy and compliant population. But Confucians extracted a price. Rulers had to at least appear virtuous and care for their subjects' welfare. The development of the imperial examination system during the Sui and Tang dynasties cemented Confucianism's dominance. These grueling tests, based primarily on Confucian classics, created a meritocratic path to government service. A brilliant peasant who mastered the texts could, in theory, become prime minister. The system produced a scholarly bureaucratic class, the literati, who administered the vast empire according to Confucian principles. Their distinctive long robes, careful calligraphy, and measured speech became symbols of civilized governance. The great Neo-Confucian synthesis of the Song dynasty, 960–1279, gave the tradition new philosophical sophistication. Thinkers like Zhu Zai integrated Buddhist and Taoist insights while maintaining Confucian social ethics. They developed elaborate metaphysical systems explaining how individual moral cultivation connected to cosmic principles. The four books, the Analects, Mencius, Great Learning and Doctrine of the Mean, became the core curriculum, their commentaries standardizing interpretation for centuries. Confucianism spread beyond China followed multiple paths. Korean kingdoms adopted Confucian governance structures as early as the Three Kingdoms period, but the Joseon dynasty, 1390–1897, created perhaps the most thoroughly Confucianized society in history. Korea took Chinese Confucianism and refined it to an almost crystalline purity, observes Professor Martina Deutschler of the School of Oriental and African Studies. Strict adherence to ritual propriety, elaborate genealogies, and intense scholarly debate characterized Korean Confucian culture. Japan's relationship with Confucianism proved more complex. While maintaining indigenous Shinto beliefs and later embracing Buddhism, Japanese elites selectively adopted Confucian ideas about loyalty, hierarchy, and education. The Tokugawa shogunate, 1603–1867, promoted Neo-Confucian learning, establishing schools that shaped samurai ethics. Yet Japanese Confucianism developed distinctive features, emphasizing loyalty to one's lord over filial piety when the two conflicted. Vietnam's millennium under Chinese rule, 111 BCE, 938 CE, deeply embedded Confucian institutions and values. Even after independence, Vietnamese dynasties maintained Confucian-style bureaucracies, examination systems, and ritual practices. The famous Temple of Literature in Hanoi, established in 1070, trained generations of Confucian scholars who administered the kingdom according to classical principles. This vast Confucian cultural sphere, stretching from Korea to Vietnam, created a shared vocabulary of governance, ethics, and social organization. Diplomatic communications used classical Chinese and Confucian ceremonial forms. Scholars could travel between countries and immediately engage in sophisticated philosophical debates. This cultural unity persisted even during periods of political conflict, creating what some historians call the Confucian Commonwealth of East Asia. Step into any Chinese corporate headquarters today, and you'll witness Confucianism's remarkable adaptation to modernity. In the gleaming towers of Shanghai's Pudong district, executives begin meetings with rounds of tea service that echo ancient ritual proprieties. Business cards are presented with both hands and a slight bow, a gesture unchanged for centuries. What appears as mere Asian business etiquette actually embodies deep Confucian principles, explains Dr. Daniel Bell of Shandong University. The emphasis on guanxi relationship networks, the preference for harmony over confrontation, the long-term perspective, these all derive from Confucian thought. Consider the case of Zhang Ruimin, CEO of Haier, one of China's most successful global companies. His management philosophy explicitly draws on Confucian principles, particularly the concept of ren in employee relations. Rather than laying off workers during economic downturns, Haier retrains them for new positions, viewing employees as part of an extended corporate family. This approach, seemingly at odds with Western capitalism's emphasis on efficiency, has helped Haier maintain loyalty and innovation through economic cycles. The Chinese education system represents perhaps the most visible continuation of Confucian tradition. Walk into any primary school classroom in Beijing or rural Yunnan, and you'll find students reciting classical texts in unison. The national curriculum mandates study of the Analects, and millions of children can quote Confucius from memory. It's not mere rote learning, insists Liu Mei, a primary school teacher in Chengdu. We use these ancient texts to discuss contemporary moral questions. When Confucius says, "Is one human being different from another?" it is in education that they diverge. My students understand this speaks to educational equality today. The infamous Gaokao, China's national college entrance examination, directly descends from imperial examinations. Though testing modern subjects rather than classical texts, the Gaokao maintains the Confucian belief that merit, demonstrated through rigorous study, should determine social advancement. The intense preparation, family involvement, and societal pressure surrounding the exam reflect deeply Confucian values about education's transformative power. Modern Chinese family structures, despite dramatic social changes, retain distinctly Confucian characteristics. The concept of Zhao, Chinese letter, or filial piety remains powerful, though its expression has evolved. Young professionals in Shenzhen might not live with their parents, but they send substantial portions of their salaries home. The pressure to marry and produce grandchildren stems partly from Confucian ideals about continuing family lines and caring for elderly parents. We see fascinating negotiations between traditional values and modern lifestyles, notes sociologist Li Zhang of Peking University. Young people use apps to order groceries for elderly parents living far away, using technology to fulfill ancient obligations. They might challenge their parents' specific demands while accepting the underlying principle of filial responsibility. The Chinese government's explicit promotion of Confucianism since the early 2000s marks a dramatic reversal from Maoist anti-Confucian campaigns. President Xi Jinping regularly quotes Confucius in speeches, promoting concepts like the harmonious society and rule by virtue, alongside rule by law. The government has established hundreds of Confucius institutes worldwide, ostensibly to teach Chinese language, but also to promote Confucian values as alternatives to Western liberal democracy. This revival serves multiple purposes. Domestically, Confucian emphasis on social harmony and respect for authority aligns with Communist Party governance goals. The tradition provides indigenous Chinese values to fill the ideological vacuum left by declining belief in Marxism. Internationally, Confucianism offers a sophisticated philosophical tradition that can engage with Western thought on equal terms. Yet this government-promoted Confucianism faces criticism for selective interpretation. They emphasize hierarchy and harmony, while downplaying Confucian ideas about rulers' moral obligations and the right to criticize authority, argues Professor C.I. Jiwei of the University of Hong Kong. Confucius himself spent years criticizing rulers who failed to govern virtuously. That critical dimension often gets lost in official presentations. The business world has embraced Confucian principles with particular enthusiasm. Jack Ma, founder of Alibaba, frequently invoked Confucian concepts in building his corporate culture. The company's emphasis on long-term thinking, stakeholder harmony, and social responsibility reflects Confucian rather than purely capitalist values. Management training programs across China now include modules on applying classical wisdom to modern business challenges. Visit the Confucius Temple in Beijing on any weekend, and you'll encounter a cross-section of contemporary Chinese society engaged with their philosophical heritage. Elderly people practice calligraphy in the courtyard, their careful strokes preserving an art form unchanged since Confucius's time. Parents bring children to rub the stone tablets, hoping academic success will transfer through touch. University students debate philosophical points under ancient cypress trees, their discussions mixing classical quotations with contemporary slang. During the annual Teachers' Day celebrations on September 28, Confucius's birthday, the temple transforms into a site of living tradition. Thousands gather for ceremonies combining ancient rituals with modern adaptations. Performers in silk robes recreate Zhou dynasty dances, while speakers use microphones to explain each gesture's significance. Government officials, teachers, and students bow before Confucius's statue, offering incense and flowers in gestures of respect unchanged for millennia. "What strikes me," observes Emma Chen, a Chinese-American student studying at Beijing University, "is how naturally my classmates move between discussing Confucius and debating contemporary issues. They'll quote the Analects to argue about artificial intelligence ethics or environmental policy. It's not treated as ancient history, but as a living resource for thinking through modern problems." The revival extends beyond formal institutions. Grassroots reading groups studying Confucian texts have proliferated across China. In Shanghai's Fuxing Park, retired Professor Wang leads weekly discussions where participants, ranging from teenagers to octogenarians, explore how Confucian wisdom applies to their daily lives. Last week we discussed, "The gentleman understands what is right. The petty person understands what is profitable in relation to housing speculation," Wang explains. These ancient words speak directly to our contemporary challenges. Young entrepreneurs have created apps teaching Confucian philosophy through games and interactive lessons. Confucius Say, downloaded millions of times, presents ethical dilemmas based on classical texts, allowing users to explore different responses and their consequences. Social media influencers quote Confucius alongside contemporary pop culture, making ancient wisdom accessible to digital natives. Even in China's most modern spaces, Confucian influence persists. The layout of new university campuses often follows traditional principles, with administrative buildings positioned according to hierarchical relationships. Corporate training centers include meditation rooms where executives practice quiet sitting, a Neo-Confucian contemplative technique. Traditional medicine clinics, experiencing a revival, explain treatments through Confucian concepts of balance and harmony. The global spread of Confucian values through the Chinese diaspora and international business creates fascinating cultural fusions. In Silicon Valley, Chinese engineers bring Confucian work ethics to startup culture. Singapore's government explicitly promotes Confucian values alongside economic modernization. Korean pop culture exports Confucian-influenced concepts of respect, hierarchy, and collective harmony to global audiences. Yet this isn't mere repetition of ancient formulas. Each application involves creative reinterpretation, adapting classical insights to unprecedented situations. When bioethicists grapple with genetic engineering, they draw on Confucian ideas about human perfectibility through cultivation. Environmental activists invoke Confucian concepts of cosmic harmony to argue for sustainable development. Tech companies use Confucian relationship ethics to design social media platforms prioritizing community over individual expression. As our documentary draws to a close, we return to where we began, those gleaming cities where ancient wisdom guides hypermodern lives. But now we understand the deep currents flowing beneath the surface. That executive presenting a business card with both hands performs a ritual stretching back to Confucius's teachings on propriety. The student studying 16 hours for the Gaokao follows a path carved by centuries of scholars pursuing self-cultivation through learning. The entrepreneur building Guanxi Networks actualizes Confucian insights about human relationships as the foundation of society. The question facing China and the world isn't whether Confucianism remains relevant, but how its insights will evolve to meet unprecedented challenges. As artificial intelligence raises questions about human nature, as globalization creates new forms of community, as environmental crisis demands new relationships with nature, Confucian philosophy offers resources for thinking through these challenges. Not answers, Confucius himself preferred questions to dogma, but ways of approaching problems that emphasize human relationships, moral cultivation, and social harmony. Confucius never claimed to create anything new, reflects Professor Tu Wei-Ming of Harvard University. He saw himself as a transmitter, connecting past wisdom to present needs. That transmission continues today, not as mechanical repetition, but as creative transformation. Every generation must rediscover what it means to be Ren, how to practice Li, how to become Junzi in their specific circumstances. The sage who wandered between states seeking a ruler who would implement his ideas might be amazed to see his influence today. Or perhaps not. Confucius understood that true transformation happens slowly, through education and example rather than force. If language is not correct, he taught, then what is said is not what is meant. If what is said is not what is meant, then what ought to be done remains undone. 25 centuries later, in boardrooms and classrooms, in family gatherings and state ceremonies, people still struggle to align words with reality, names with actuality, ideals with practice. This is Confucius's enduring gift, not a fixed system, but a way of thinking about human flourishing. In a world often divided between those who prioritize individual freedom and those who emphasize collective harmony, Confucianism offers a third path: the cultivation of individuality through relationships, the achievement of personal excellence through social responsibility. As humanity faces challenges requiring both innovation and wisdom, both change and continuity, the teacher from Lu continues to instruct. The bronze bells still ring in temples across Asia, their ancient tones now mixed with modern city sounds. But the real continuation of Confucian tradition happens in countless daily acts. A teacher staying late to help a struggling student, a business leader considering community impact alongside profit, a child caring for aging parents, a citizen speaking truth to power while maintaining respect. In these moments, the philosophy lives and evolves, proving that some insights transcend their historical origins to become permanent resources for human civilization. Confucius once said, "If there was a ruler who achieved order without taking any action, it was perhaps Shun. There was nothing for him to do but to hold himself in a respectful posture and face due south." This ideal of leadership through moral example rather than coercion remains radical. In an age of global interconnection, environmental crisis, and technological transformation, the Confucian vision of cultivated individuals creating harmonious communities through virtuous relationships offers both challenge and hope. The journey that began in ancient Lu continues, its destination not a fixed endpoint but an ongoing process of becoming more fully human. This is the way of Confucius, forever ancient, forever new, forever asking us to examine our lives and relationships in pursuit of a more harmonious world.